Hi there and welcome to Real Talk in ELT, a podcast about the reality of teaching English. I'm your host, Kelly Pennington. Thank you for joining me today. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of Real Talk in ELT. This episode is going to be a little... how can I say this? Well, I have an Irish temper. I'm probably 50% Irish. I've got the red ginger hair and the complexion to match. So if nobody knows the stereotype of having an Irish temper, I definitely have one. So I get very agitated very quickly. And usually it dissipates just as quickly as it comes up. But that doesn't mean that little things won't set me off. So I try to stay calm. It's like, meditation and breathing and water, but that only can go so far. So let me tell you what was happening. And this episode will be a little bit of a rant, but then also I'm going to back it up with some theoretical information that I've come across and I've known about, and I think it's relative to this point. And it's probably going to be informational for some people as a way to deal with the irritation. So I was on social media, not a huge fan of social media. I have to say, I struggle with it every day. I know that it's necessary, but I'm just not a big fan. I'm just not a huge fan of social media. Anyways, so it was the weekend. I was hanging out with my husband. We were chill, just doing nothing, having a great time. And the dog was running around. I mean, just a very relaxing weekend. And all of a sudden, here comes Kelly's Irish temper. So what happened was I was scrolling through things mindlessly. I really wasn't paying attention to that much, but just kind of seeing what was going on, what was happening in the social media world. And I kept coming across the same posts or videos or reels or stories or wherever, TikToks, whatever. I'm not on TikTok, but I'm assuming that some of them come from there. So it was that same thing that's been happening for a while. I mean, this is actually nothing new. So it was the same thing where people say, don't say this, say that. And the one that set me off, you know the videos I'm talking about, the people when they say, don't say thank you because you have to say it like this to sound like a native. I mean, I hope these people are joking. And if they're not joking, there's so much to unpack there that is just wrong. But anyways, the one that set me off was, it had two columns and it had very with an adjective. And then it had another set of adjectives that were more or less the equivalent of those adjectives. And it said, very bad. And then on the other column, it would say terrible. And then it would say very angry. And then on the other column, infuriated. I'm sure most English teachers have seen this. I'm actually sure that most English students have seen it. But what set off that little Irish temper of mine was that the categories that they put it under. And it was like basic and fluent. And I just had a fit. I couldn't deal with it. My husband looked at me and he was just like, what is your problem? And I was like, I can't do it. And I went off. I just couldn't deal with it anymore. And so here's the thing that irritates me about those is that both of those options are very correct. And they're very correct in multiple contexts. And so when we say something like, this is not fluent, this is basic English, or this is like a bad version and this is the better version, or this is the non-native speaker version, this is the native speaker version, we're saying to people that these linguistic options of describing things or expressing themselves are invalid. And that is not true. It's not true on multiple levels because, for example, I say it's very bad today. I say that. And it's not because I'm talking to my students who might be, just starting their language journey. I say that to people who are natives, who are non-natives, who are highly proficient, who are fluent. I mean, I will say very bad to anyone in almost any context. So that the connotation, the idea that when we put those posts and stuff to make people think that the more complex your language is, the more fluent you are. Yes and no. Here's the thing. You have to achieve higher levels of proficiency, you have to be able to deal with a larger variety of complexities and simplistic and complex language. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you're always going to defer to the complex language, because situationally it might not be appropriate. So if, and I was talking to a couple friends this past week, really good colleagues of mine, and for some reason this keeps popping up and I just wanted to address it. So all of these people on Instagram and social media and all that good stuff, I don't want to say like stop doing what you're doing, but kind of stop doing what you're doing because it's giving people the wrong impression. It's giving people the impression that this is a bad option. This is not the correct option. And it is the correct and viable option for many people in many contexts. So the one thing that I did want to show people, and this is kind of where my mind went. I mean, again, I was, I think it was Sunday morning, having an absolute fit and screeching and just being all sorts of ugly because I was fed up, and my little Irish temper, I just had to get it under control. I walked away, I brushed my teeth, and then I calmed down. So let me introduce this to you because I think that this is important, and hopefully, let me see if I can share the screen. Okay, we'll put it like that. So if you're just listening and you're not watching, no big deal. I will go through kind of this slide. This was a quick reference that I had from a book that I remember just off the top of my head, but there's lots of resources that you can look into about accommodation theory and language teaching and things like that. So I think this popped into my head because when we say that these options are wrong, we're kind of trying to, I don't know, maybe eliminate that as a possibility. And I don't think we should ever eliminate any language option as a possibility for language learners or for speakers or anything. So, sorry, the book that this is from is called Theoretical Considerations and Language Education. This specific chapter is written by, and I'm probably going to say this name wrong, and I apologize in advance, Özlem Adale, I think. And it's from chapter 8. It's called Accommodation Theory and Language Teaching. And so it starts out with this really interesting introduction, which I would like to read or somehow post, but I'm not sure about copyright. So I'm just going to read part of it for you. But here's the general idea. So the terms, the speech accommodation theory, there's a couple terms that you need to be familiar with that would be helpful if you're trying to think of accommodation theory and what that means. So the term speech accommodation theory, or SAT, was first coined by Howard Giles in 1973. Subsequent to that, there were several studies and very influential people that started working on this idea of speech accommodation theory. And because they were doing that and having so many results, speech accommodation theory has become more interdisciplinary. And Giles in 1987 coined communication accommodation theory, or CAT, which not only included linguistic adjustments, but also nonverbal features. So, and then gesture, smiling, posture, and other communicative behavior were added to SAT. So it kind of expanded a little bit more as they researched this and went into more studies, I guess you can say. They were looking at how people were interacting with each other. So let me explain accommodation theory just very quickly. So accommodation theory describes how people adjust their language and communication patterns to those of others. Since its emergence in the 70s, the theory has been used in the fields of social psychology and sociolinguistics. For example, Gumpers in 1982 examined the link between linguistic variability and its effect on social status. He observed that language is a social practice and thus links human beings to their community and the time and area they live in. This, in turn, leads to social inequality and difference through communication. Gumpers also introduced the notion of speech communities, which are smaller subdivisions of society we live in. He stressed that communication breakdown occurs when people from different speech communities do not know the cultural linguistic norms of the community, such as where to put emphasis and how to use intonation. It also occurs when individuals fail to understand others' feelings using contextual clues specific to that community. Hence, it becomes clear that communication, even among people from the same society, can become a main struggle if they're unfamiliar with these norms. In order to avoid communication breakdown, people accommodate their language to that of their communication partner. So this is kind of the idea of accommodation theory. So if you make it very, very simplistic, we'll look at it like this. For example, and my good friend Evan used this example too, and this is the example that I love using. If you look at a woman, a grown woman, adult woman that speaks whatever language you want her to speak, it doesn't matter what language. If she's speaking to a child that's, let's say, under the age of 5, she's going to speak in a very specific way to that child because she's accommodating her language for her speech partner who happens to be a child at that point. That same woman can then go to work, and let's say she's an executive at an architectural firm or something along those lines, and she's talking to business colleagues and her like a boss or a client or something like that. Her language is going to be accommodated for the new social group that she's interacting with. So when we put these posts on Instagram and say, listen, you can't say this anymore because it's basic, you have to say this. There's no way that that woman is going to use the more advanced complex language when she's talking to a child to try to get the child ready to go to school, for example. And there's no way that overly complex or perhaps academic, which is considered, English for specific purposes. Like if we go into the academic world, if you're writing a essay for a university or a dissertation or your thesis, you're going to use very specific language that is appropriate for that speech community. And if you're trying to sound exactly like your thesis paper when you're talking to colleagues to try and set up the next meeting, it's not going to make sense. You accommodate your language every single time you're interacting with somebody because you want to have this connection with them. The whole idea is that you're communicating with these people. So you adjust your language depending on who you're interacting with. So if you put these things on Instagram and say, don't say this anymore, the Irish is coming out in me. I'm not going to say it, but that's malarkey. That is not true. That's not true. You can say those things. It just depends on who you're talking to. And some of the things that they put on there that, oh, this is what a fluent person says, or this is what a native person says, which is gross to me, by the way. We'll get into native speakerism in a different time. But if you say but that's not necessarily appropriate in all situations for all speech partners, when you're having a dialogue with somebody. So wrong. The two other things that I would like to include in this ranty podcast that I'm throwing out here are these two ideas of convergence and divergence. So convergence, excuse me. So under this theory, the CAT, right, the communication accommodation theory, it suggests that speakers converge, meaning they make their speech more similar to the people that they're communicating with, so as to belong and integrate to a certain group or individual. So this is in accordance with, all of the attraction theories and things like that. So the motivations that underlie people to converge are twofold. First, there's effective motivation, and then there's communicative efficiency motivation. So the more similar that we are to somebody else, the more attractive we become to that person. So if you're talking to somebody and your speech pattern mimics or converges with the speech pattern of your partner, your communication partner, the more attractive it is. And I'm not saying attractive like, oh, you want to be with this person. No, it becomes attractive like they become more engaged. They have a higher affinity to continue that conversation with you. So yeah, so we try to converge usually because we want to have a higher effective motivation to stay in that conversation, and also we want there to be communicative efficiency, because we want to get to the point. We want to resolve whatever we're discussing as effectively as possible. So the other idea is divergence, which is contrary, obviously, to convergence. And in divergence, the speaker wants to differentiate himself from the group or communication partner. So when you want to remain distinct or dissimilar from the group, it's because being affiliated with that group for whatever reason, you want to separate. You don't want to be lumped into the group. So a good example of this is terrible bosses. So when you have a terrible boss, they usually have a little bit of divergence when they're having these within it's a speech community, right? Because you're all working for the same company, but there's a little bit of divergence because they want to distinguish themselves from the group. So there's the workers and then there's the boss. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with this. This is not something that I am a proponent of, but this happens. This is just something that happens. I'm not supporting it. Okay. So the speakers will try to employ a little bit of divergence to distinguish themselves or differentiate their speech patterns from those of the group, because they don't, for whatever reason, they don't want to be associated with that group. So this whole idea of accommodation theory, convergence and divergence is actually quite interesting. I find it to be interesting, at least. I mean, I'm not sure if anybody else does, but this is the idea. So if you're interested in checking it out or looking into something along these lines, I think it's very, very useful, especially for language teachers, because it helps people start to identify some patterns in the speech communities that they participate in. And so they'll be able to more effectively either use the idea of convergence to assimilate themselves into that speech community, to be understood a little bit better, or if they, for whatever reason, want to differentiate themselves from a speech community or distinguish themselves from their speech partner, then they could probably start looking at the ideas of divergence. Again, you might not introduce these in your classroom the way that I'm introducing it, but it's an interesting idea, and activities can definitely be built off of it. Almost done with my rant. So when you see these things on Instagram and social media, unfortunately, this is the first thing that I think about. That's not right. It's not right to say that, because the overwhelming assumption is that that language is inappropriate, and it's not inappropriate. It really, really depends on who is your speech partner and how you're communicating with them. That is going to influence you and how you're acting and what you're saying, and probably employing this idea of the communication accommodation theory, and whether or not you're employing a little bit of convergence and divergence. So please, people, be a little bit more responsible with what we're posting online, and just label it as an alternative or contextualize it a little bit. Because not all of the things that we're deeming as low level or bad, or I'm sorry to say, non-native speakers or whatever, this negative connotation to it, those are totally viable and acceptable options for people to use in their language. So let's contextualize that a little bit better than just posting things and saying, this is wrong, this is better. Well, not necessarily. That's it for me today. Hopefully this has been not super angry. It was a little bit of a rant. I apologize, but I'm Irish. I can't help it. I got pumped up about this. So I hope that was useful, and I hope to see you soon on the next episode. Thank you and take care.
Ready to join the conversation? Head on over to Instagram at Real Talk and ELT Pod or at Kelly Pennington ELT and send me a message. That's it for me. Take care of yourself, your health, your vibe, and your tribe. Until next time.